All right, 6.3, cities and globalization. We are still on the same enduring understanding. We are going to talk about how cities embody the process of globalization. We would not have cities like we have if we were not a global world like we are. So our essential knowledge here is world cities, which is a vocabulary term, function at the top of the world's urban hierarchy and drive globalization. And cities are connected globally by networks and linkages and mediate global processes. So this section is pretty straightforward in the essential knowledge, but there are some details that need to be known and some geographical identification. What are the world cities? Well, I'll tell you. The world cities, or global cities, I've seen them called. But since world cities is what is in the CED, that's what you should remember. These are cities that exert influence beyond their national boundaries. They are media hubs, financial centers, influential stock exchanges, banks, corporate headquarters, and headquarters for international organizations. So this is not about population density. This is about what kinds of things are in the city that make it important. So London, Paris, New York, Tokyo, and then recently Dubai, Singapore, Shanghai, and Sydney. So Beijing is not a world city. It's a capital, but it's not a world city. Shanghai has a lot more importance to the world and connection to the world than Beijing does. So this is just a slide of our cities, and you can see the graph there. Purple is how they rank in economy, research and development, environment, accessibility, livability, that's the light blue one, right? What is most livable? They say Paris is most livable, but the economy is number 14, right? So each world city is a little bit different in how it all works, but and how everything is balanced. But what makes London a world city and not, say, Vienna is the connection to the outside world. All right, forward capital. This is another vocabulary word. It didn't fit anywhere else in the topic, so I just stuck it in here. It's when a country builds a special capital city, and they try to build it in the center of the population, as it were. So there are three well-known forward capitals in the world: Washington, D.C. in the United States, Brasilia in Brazil, and Canberra in Australia. Now, Washington, D.C. was built in the 1800s, and in the 1800s, the center of the U.S. population was on the East Coast because U.S. history, if you understand or know U.S. history, manifests destiny when American citizens started moving across and taking over the Midwest and the West Coast. That didn't happen until the late 1800s. So when Washington, D.C. was built, where they picked it was the center of the population, and it's the red dot there on the map. If the United States of America were to build a forward capital now, it would likely be in Kansas somewhere because that's the population center, right? So center doesn't mean where the most people are, but if you average the population on each side and pick a spot to be central to equidistant for all that population, the middle of the United States of America would probably be where it would pick. Kansas City actually might be where they picked. Brasilia is in Brazil, and it's up there in the middle, trying to center around the populations. Again, most for like China, most of the population of Brazil is on the coast, but there are larger cities in the center, and then the population of the Amazon is not abundant, but enough so that they wanted to place their city close there. And then Canberra in Australia, it's on the coast, right? But Australia, all of the people in Australia are on the east coast because the middle of Australia is a giant desert. The west coast has some people, but with Sydney and Brisbane being and Melbourne all being on the east coast, Canberra is where the center of population is. Brasilia, this is a picture of Brasilia. So these are planned cities that are planned for, like front offices in our industry section, they're not planned for use or functionality, they're planned to impress. So I've been to Brasilia, and it is a really strange city to be a tourist in because it's sectionalized so that all the hotels are in one section and all the malls are in another section. So if I'm a visitor and I'm at the hotel, it's really hard for me to get to a mall. It's not mixed use at all. but it is it was built in the 1950s, and it just feels very strange. It feels lifeless and like it doesn't have a vibrant life, which it really doesn't, because it was built to be a governmental capital and to impress. So it's these giant structures that really don't have the life of a bustling city inside it. Same with Washington, D.C. I haven't been to Washington, D.C. in 10 years maybe, but it feels like a museum rather than a city. Now, of course, in the surrounding areas, in the suburbs of these places, there's life and functionality. But Washington, D.C. is not really built to function as a city. It's built to function as an impressive foreign capital, right? And so we've got all these, look at the similarities between these open malls and these strips. It's built to impress people and not to really function as an urban center. Yes? And that is it for 6.3. Take a deep breath. And we dive into 6.4, which is a little longer and has some more difficult concepts in it. The size and distribution of cities. How are cities ranked by size? Why are some cities big and some cities small? And where are they located within the spatial distribution of a map? Okay, we're still in the same enduring understanding. So identify the different urban concepts such as hierarchy, interdependence, relative size, and stacking that are useful to explaining the distribution, size, and interaction of cities. So here we have the essential knowledge. Principles that are useful for explaining the distribution size of the cities include rank size rule, primate city, the gravity theory, and Christoller's central place theory. So what we have here are 4 theories or descriptions of how cities are distributed through the world. So the first one is the rank size rule. This describes one way cities within a region or state can develop. So the nth largest city in any region will be 1n the size of the largest city. So you look at the case study in Germany there, right? The biggest city on the left is about 5 times bigger than the smallest city on the right. So it builds stair steps, yes? So Berlin is a giant city, but Hamburg is about half as big, and then Munich is about half as big as that, and then, so let's say Cologne. Cologne is about half as big as that, and Frankfurt is about half as big as that. So here is a little powtoon that explains rank size rule.
it using Powtoon.
All right, so primate city. It's not the opposite of rank size, but when in the countries that don't where rank size rule does not apply, usually features a primate city. And the law of the primate theory is that there's just one giant city in the region, and the rest of them are really, really small. And this happens when the population doesn't demand, we'll talk about this later when we talk about central place theory, when the population doesn't demand smaller cities with services, they all go to the big city to do it all. It happens in less developed countries where cities are new, but it also happens in countries that are really small, and there's no geographical reason for rank size rule because one big city is enough to serve the entire population. So a primate city is usually the only economic, social, and political hub of a state. They're more common in LDCs than MDCs, but they're also common in developed countries when the developed countries are tiny, right? And so countries that have a unitary system of government or a strong central government are often the ones that follow the primate city rule. Of course, this is not the case in China. So urban primacy, the United Kingdom. London is the largest city in the country, and the small size of the country and the unitary government and the well-developed transportation infrastructure reduced the need for medium-sized cities and mid-level services. So if I'm really sick and I'm in Manchester, it's pretty easy for me to get to London to a giant specialist hospital. If I'm really sick in New York and the best hospital, or let's not say New York, if I'm really sick in Reno, Nevada, and the best hospital for me to go to is in New York, that's pretty far away. But Los Angeles, which is nearer to Reno, Nevada than New York, will probably have the same level of medical care that New York does. Even though the population is smaller, the services are similar, right? And so the United States, being geographically larger in area, requires more mid-sized cities. And so it usually has the rank size rule. Germany is not an enormous country, but it still follows the rank size rule because of the way the population is distributed. Now, Mexico City is a different example of a primate city. It's a lesser developed country. It's a big country, right? But the population density is centered around where the primate city is. Mexico City is the primate city. So the population density up there in the north, and that's you kind of see where the light blue meets the green up at the north, that's the border of Texas. The population up there is very sparse. It is growing because of the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, has caused maquiladoras, right, factories, special economic zones, economic processing zones, to be built up there. And so the population is growing up there, and we might see a large city develop because of that. But right now, most of the population density is down around Mexico City. So if I need medical care or something important, Mexico City is not that far for me to travel, right? You don't want to have to travel a very long way to receive mid-level services, but in northern Mexico, some people do. So here's a comparison between two types of primate cities, London and Mexico City. Yeah. So London is 14 million, the next biggest city is 2.6 million. So that's primate. Manchester's big, and there's a university there, there's all sorts of interesting things in Manchester, but it doesn't have everything London has. And you can get to London from Manchester in an hour and a half by train, so it's not very far if you really, really need something important. All right, gravity model. This is how cities interact with each other. And so it's like gravity, right? The biggest in space, and I'm not a scientist, but a large planet in space has a gravitational pull that pulls everything in around it. And if there's another planet with a lesser gravitational pull near it, it's not going to win. Everything's going to be pulled towards that big planet. Like people are pulled towards a big personality. So cities that are larger and closer together have greater interaction than places that are smaller and farther away from each other, right? This is pretty self-explanatory. So the model is used to predict the flow of workers, shoppers, vacationers, migrants, how we're going to deliver the mail. And so if you have a mid-sized city that's really close and very interactive with the big city, there's no reason to recreate things that are in that big city in the mid-sized city if people are willing to travel that far to get it. Yes? So here's a picture of the gravity model. The shorter distance between the two objects the greater the mass of either or both objects, and the greater gravitational pull between the objects. So you see that city 3 is pulled both towards city 1 and city 2, but less so to city 2. You'll see that city 2 is mostly pulled towards city 1 and less so to city 2. So if I'm in city 2 and I need something important, I'm going to go to city 1. I'm not going to go to city 3, usually, right? And again, these are models and theories, so they're not always 100% true. So exception to the gravity model are places like Orlando in Florida, where Disney World and Universal Studios are, and Las Vegas, Nevada, where all of the gambling and entertainment is. So these are tourist destinations, and they attract a ton of visitors, many, many more than their size would suggest. So because they offer specialized services, specialized reasons for people to come, there's an attraction, there's a gravity pull. So the size of the city is not the gravity pull, it's the services that are there. If I want to go to Disney World, there are 2 places in America I can go to Disney. I can go in Orlando or I can go in Anaheim, California, on the opposite ends, right? I have to pick one or the other, right? And so it's not which one's largest, it's just there's only 2 places to get that, so I have to choose one. And the same type of thing holds true for people, or for religious sites, places where religious pilgrims go. So there's only one Mecca, and you can't say, well, Mecca's too far, I'm just going to go to Mecca somewhere else. Mecca is Mecca. Jerusalem is Jerusalem. Washington, D.C. is Washington, D.C. Beijing is Beijing. So the pull of these places is not determined by how large they are or what they're near. The pull is determined by what specialized services or tourist attractions are there. Yes? If you say no, what am I going to do? I don't know that you said no. If you say no at any point, type me up an email and say, hey, Dr. Blackwood, I'm confused. Can we talk? I'd be happy to talk to you. All right, the final theory, which reads into all that we've talked about, is central place theory. How far are people willing to go for certain services? And this determines where cities are. So this was developed by Walter Christaller in 1933. It actually holds pretty true now, even though it's an early theory before we had the development of the transportation systems that we have now. But it's malleable in a sense that transportation doesn't displace the theory. Transportation just adds to it. So there's a market, and there's a threshold, and there's a range, and it all determines on where things are going to be placed and why cities are where they are. So the central place is the place where people go to receive goods and services. And it doesn't have to be a giant city, right? In the middle of a rural area, a small town with a gas station and a convenience store, it is going to be your central place, because that's the only place to get gas. It's the only place to get food, or a post office, right? Or a religious center. So it doesn't have to be a giant city, but it does have to be the place that people are drawn to because of the services. The airport, the hospital, right? Usually the airports and the hospitals are located near larger cities, but if they weren't, they would still be just as busy, because airports are needed by everybody. And so it's the central place magnetizes the area around it to draw people to the goods and services. So any city size in between, giant or tiny, can be a central place as long as that's where people go. So Christaller played with this for a while. He tried a square, but in a square there are those corners that are distant from one another. Then he tried a circle, and the circles don't interconnect the way he wanted them to. So he compromised with this hexagon. So he calls them hexagonal hinterlands, which I think is funny and alliterative, because the shape is a compromise between a square and a circle. So he nests those hexagons on top of each other. So what you're seeing here, and this might not make sense until I show you the next slide, is that that red star in the middle is the giant central place. And then the blue squares, or diamonds, I guess, are the smaller central places. And then the yellow dots are the even smaller central places. So if I live in a yellow dot and I need something important that I can't find in the blue diamond, I'm going to go to the red star. But if I can find it in the black triangle, boy, my shapes are bad today, or the blue diamond, that's where I'm going to go. So you nest these squares about basically where the services are, right? So at first, here on the left, there was a village. So the villages are the little dots. And the hexagons around those little dots are where people live that would go to that village for services. If I live closer to the village in the other hexagon, I'm going to go to that village, right? So the trading boundary becomes this hexagon shaped because I'm not going to go to the Starbucks that's farther than the Starbucks that is right down the street. Why would I do that? So if I live near a village that has trading, I'm going to go to that village unless another village offers something really crazy special, right? And so you get these hexagonal shapes. And then some villages become giant towns, so we get this larger hexagonal shape that is placed over the smaller ones, right? So our villages are still there, we're just not seeing them on the map. But these larger towns that are offering more and more services are now drawing more people, so we have this giant, a bigger hexagon placed over the small hexagons on the left. And then it grows again, and we have cities, right? So we have these big, bold dots and these big, bold lines, but you can still see when you look the smaller hexagons from the town size and the even smaller hexagons from the village size. Right, so my villages and my towns are still there, but now my central place is this giant city, and that's where I'm going to go. So when you go back here, the red star is the big bold dots that are here on the right? That's the city. And then the blue diamonds and the black triangles are your town size, or your mid-size hexagons in this middle town description. And then your little yellow dots are your villages. Make sense? Hopefully. So this is all determined by two things called threshold and range. They determine what services will be available and how far apart central services should be located. Yes? So threshold is the size of a population necessary for any service to exist and remain profitable. So there are low threshold businesses like convenience stores, like coffee shops, like gas stations, right? I don't need an enormous number of people to keep my convenience store in business. That has a low threshold. A medium threshold requires more people. Restaurants, hospitals, high schools, department stores, you need a larger population to survive. And then high threshold, things like stock market centers, major sports teams. We'll do if we come back to school, we'll do a project when you come back about placing a National Football League team in the United States. Where's a good place for that? Symphony orchestras, opera houses, elite research centers, airports, right? These high thresholds need larger population to keep them in business, to support themselves. So there's a reason there are fewer airports than there are Starbucks in the world, right? So low threshold are places that don't need much population to support its existence, and then high threshold are the ones that need a giant population to support its existence. And you're going to travel farther for those high threshold things than you are for your low threshold things. So range is the distance people will travel to obtain specific goods and services. So people will travel much farther for a heart transplant or to catch a plane than they will to buy a tube of toothpaste or a cup of coffee, right? So it's those high threshold services that have longer range. So fast food restaurants are found in every town, but high-level research hospitals aren't. Here is a video. It's by a real estate agent in Wilmington, North Carolina. And he explains it using vaping, which is not the best example, but he does do a pretty good job of explaining the thought process behind opening a business, and the thought process ties right into central place theory.
Hi, my name is Teddy Smith. I'm a real estate broker, and today I'm going to explain the central place theory as it applies to real estate. Maybe back in your high school or college days, you and your buddies were hanging out in the woods, and you noticed that there are certain patterns in nature that always occur, like plants and trees always take fork shapes for some reason. And if you've looked at a map long enough, you may have noticed something along these lines. You notice a pattern in the way that people are populating cities, but you just can't really place a finger on it, so to speak. Well, a couple smart German geographers came up with the central place theory, and it's basically an academic theory that tries to explain why people settle in cities the way that they do. First, let's compare two places. The first would be the New York Financial District, which is home to some of the highest paid, most technical jobs in the world, and it attracts people from all over the world. And then we have your local vape shop, which would be almost the complete opposite. So New York Financial District would be considered a high threshold business according to these geographers. And there are a couple other financial districts like New York, LA, Chicago. There are very few. And if you compare these on a map, they're relatively equidistant to each other. So let's have something a little less of a threshold. So Wilmington, North Carolina has a population of 100,000. And if you compare cities of almost the exact same population, there's more of them, but if you take a look, they're just as equidistant from each other. Okay, so the lowest threshold would be a vape shop. It has low overhead, it's very non-technical, and people will not travel large distances to go to a vape shop. And I'm not going to even try and map out every vape shop in the United States because that would take forever. So if a business has a high threshold, it's going to be located farther away from each other, and there's usually going to be less of them. And if a business has a very low threshold, the distances between them are going to be smaller, but there's going to be more of them. So I've got the crazy idea that I want to open up a vape shop. So let's apply central place theory to this. When I look at a map of the place that I live in Wilmington, I see all these vape shops around. But I know that the business is a very low threshold and that people travel small distances to get to a vape shop. And as I look at the map, I notice that vape shops in the area are on average located about 2 miles from each other. And I've researched my demographics and looked at some other locations, and I've determined at the places with the thumbtacks that I may be able to open up my own vape shop. My knowledge of central place theory really paid off, and my vape locations are totally slammed, and I am rolling in the money. With all the money from my successful vape shops, I'm ready to move to the next level, or a higher threshold business, which is going to be the ultimate vape warehouse. The vape warehouse is going to be very high threshold. It's going to attract a bigger draw of people from all around. It's going to produce more cash flow, and it's going to be more capital intensive. I have to hire very skilled labor in order to operate this thing. But we know that because it's so high threshold, it has to be located farther away from other vape warehouses. And there's already another vape warehouse in Raleigh, North Carolina. We've looked at some of the data, and other vape warehouses are at a minimum 500 miles away, and Raleigh's only 200 miles away. And also, we've done some research, and the demographic data suggests it could be feasible. Your family before said opening up tiny vape shop stores was a stupid idea, but this time your family thinks that the vape warehouse is a great idea. But according to your data, you think no, so you decline on the deal. And thank God that you subscribed to this channel, because your competitor actually took the deal and he went bankrupt trying to make the vape warehouse a success. Anyways, I hope that you guys liked this video. Please subscribe to my channel and check out some of my other videos on real estate investing finance.
Right, so again, kids, don't vape, right? But the concept that a vape shop is a low threshold, but a warehouse is a medium threshold is a good concept to remember, right? So low threshold is Starbucks stores. But medium threshold would be distribution houses for the coffee beans, and high threshold would be, the airport that the beans are flown in on. Does that make sense? I hope it does. All right. Why cities are where they are.
This is a win.
I hope this is the video. This is a longer one. It has a little bit of extra information in it, but it does a pretty good job of explaining better than I can central place theory, gravity model, and all the other things we have talked about. Is this the video?
This is a Wendover Productions video made possible by Squarespace. Make your next move with a beautiful website from Squarespace. The Cumberland Valley is home to 6 towns lying between Hagerstown, Maryland, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Greencastle, Chambersburg, Shippensburg, Newville, Carlisle, and Mechanicsburg. What's exceptional about these small Pennsylvania towns is that they're each almost exactly 10 miles from each other. The distances deviate by no more than a mile from this rule. This isn't a coincidence and this isn't planned. Drawing equal-sized radii around each town shows you their spheres of influence. Assuming each town has the exact same shops and services, rational people will go to whichever town is closest to buy or sell goods. Towns 10 miles apart mean that nobody has to travel more than 5 miles to reach a town. Each one of these towns was founded before the formation of the United States, so that means that, of course, nobody had cars, and pretty much everybody walked everywhere. 10 miles, or 5 miles each way, is about the distance a person can comfortably walk in a day with enough time to buy or sell goods at a central market. Back in this era before cars, a 5-mile radius was essentially the largest possible commuter zone to small agricultural towns, and therefore having towns 10 miles apart was the most efficient possible use of rural land. When you get the chance, take a look at a map of a rural area that existed before cars. You'll see that the distance between medium-sized towns is almost always somewhere between about 10 to 15 miles. Because the Cumberland Valley is a valley, towns really could only develop in a line, but in most cases, towns develop in all directions. This is what the 10-mile rule looks like when going out in all directions. Each of these points is a town, and the hexagon around it is the area from which people will go to the town. In the real world, each of these towns probably has a small grocery store, a pharmacy, a bank, and maybe a restaurant. Since everybody uses these services, there doesn't have to be many people in a town's sphere of influence in order to sustain these shops. But where do you put something more specialized, like a mechanic? People only need to go to the mechanic every once in a while, so you need more people to sustain one mechanic shop than one grocery store. Well, some of these small towns develop into larger towns with more people that can support more specialized shops and services. Putting these larger towns with more specialized shops closer together would be unsustainable, since there wouldn't be enough people going to those shops. But putting them farther apart would be inefficient, since there's land that people would not go to a city from. This happens once or twice more until you have cities. These cities have the largest spheres of influence and the most specialized shops. You of course still have grocery stores and pharmacies in cities, but you also have things like luxury car dealerships, brain surgery centers, and airports. The city's sphere of influence is enormous because people will travel hundreds of miles to buy an expensive car or get brain surgery or fly from an airport. Think about it within a city. How far would you walk to buy a latte? Probably only a few blocks, and that's why you see Starbucks or other coffee shops on almost every block. Since almost everyone buys coffee, you only need a few blocks of people to sustain one coffee shop. But how far would you walk to buy a MacBook? Probably quite far, since it's an infrequent and substantial purchase. That's why Apple stores are rather rare even in cities. You need an enormous amount of people to sustain one Apple store, and we can actually figure out roughly how many. In Connecticut, the Trumbull Apple Store is about 20 miles away from the New Haven store to the northeast and the Stamford store to the southwest. In the 10-mile radius around the Trumbull Apple Store, there are about 500,000 inhabitants, which tells us that you need about 500,000 people to sustain one Apple store. We can compare that to the Starbuckses of Lower Manhattan, which are spread out at an average distance of about 600 feet. Drawing a 300-foot radius around one Starbucks in Lower Manhattan covers about 6,000 people, which means that one Starbucks needs 6,000 people to sustain it. Of course, both Connecticut and New York are places with higher than average incomes, which means that less people are needed to sustain one Starbucks or Apple store. The numbers would be very different in, say, rural Kansas. But since each store generally only builds in areas with higher than average incomes, this gives a good sense of how many people Apple and Starbucks look for in an area before opening up a store. So our model shows where cities should be, but it's not like this in reality. This is the most efficient spread of cities, if you're assuming that cities are on a perfectly flat plane with no geographic features, no social influences, no variability of income, equal distribution of resources, essentially assuming the world is one homogeneous place, which it's not. In reality, of course, our world has an enormous effect on where and why cities develop. To start out, let's cut this down to one city on a flat, featureless plane for simplicity. What affects the location of cities more than anything is water. If we put an ocean on one side of our isotropic plane, our city will almost certainly locate near it. Oceans have always been and still are what connects the world. There's no other means of transport that can move such enormous amounts of cargo for so little. Any city needs to be economically efficient to grow, and it will cost more to bring goods to a city that's 1,000 miles inland than one right by the ocean. Just look at Europe. 6 of the 10 largest European cities are within 100 miles of the coast. But oceans aren't the only bodies of water to affect cities. Rivers are just as, or perhaps even more influential. Milan, the 19th largest European city, is the largest to not be either directly on the ocean or on a river, and even then it's only 15 miles from a river and 75 miles from the ocean. Until the last century or so, cities could not survive without direct water access. If you need more proof, 14 of the 15 largest cities in the world are within a few dozen miles of the ocean. Perhaps the most obvious attractor for cities is resources. So going back to our isotropic plane, putting natural resources anywhere on this map will draw cities near it. Cities that existed before the last century or so generally sprung up right near the resources, much like Pittsburgh, since they acted as manufacturing and transportation hubs for those resources. But more recently, new resource-dependent cities don't need to be as close to the resources themselves. New transportation technologies can bring the resources from their source. Just look at Dubai. Of course, the UAE has enormous oil deposits, but they're much closer to Abu Dhabi and the southwest than Dubai. In 1900, Dubai had 10,000 residents, less than half that of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, one of the farming towns we talked about at the beginning. That only grew to 40,000 by 1960, but today it's known worldwide and has more than 2.5 million residents. It was able to grow at this enormous rate, even faster than Abu Dhabi, since it cemented itself as the economic and administrative hub for the oil industries of the region. Another geographic feature that we can add to the plane is mountains. Now, mountains don't always have a uniform effect on cities. Mexico City, Bogota, and Addis Ababa are all enormous cities at elevations above 7,000 feet. Mountains do make transport and trade difficult, but they also provide protection. Many ancient cities grew in these locations since they were easy to protect, which left more time to focus on growing the city. But mountains can also hinder development. For quite a while, the United States could not develop west of the Appalachian Mountains. They just served as an enormous barrier. In 1800, the average center of population for the entire United States was here, even though the US had sovereignty over this entire area. Of course, technology eventually conquered this barrier and moved the mean population center all the way out to Missouri today. But if the Appalachian Mountains didn't exist, American history and geography would be completely different. We would have seen urban development much earlier in the Midwest. But mountains can also have another effect. You see, coal, silver, gold, and other mineral deposits are all often located in mountainous regions. And just like Dubai, cities can develop in less hospitable and easy places due to resources. The economic advantage of exploiting the resources overpowers the economic disadvantage of being in an inhospitable location. Denver, Colorado grew 650% between 1870 and 1880 with the opening of a railroad branch connecting with the Transcontinental Railroad. It served as an access point to transportation to the gold miners in the Rockies. So, mountains can either push cities away or bring them nearer. It really just depends on the circumstance. Let's exchange our isotropic plane for a world map. Where should cities be on here? Well, our world's cities are not necessarily in all the most geographically efficient locations. While there is a certain level of natural selection that grows the efficiently placed cities and shrinks the inefficiently placed cities, humans are not always able to put cities in the most efficient locations. Let's put up the 224 cities in the world with a population over 2 million. You can immediately see some patterns. Putting up the equator, you can see there's a clear divide. Only 32 of these cities lie in the southern hemisphere. One might think that this is because there is so much more land in the northern hemisphere, but that's not entirely true. You see, the southern hemisphere still has 32% of the world's land, but only has 14% of the world's large cities. There's clearly a higher density of cities in the northern hemisphere. You can pretty much trace this all back to Europe and Asia. The first large civilizations and empires were on these two continents, even though the human race likely originated in Africa. There's hundreds of different theories on why civilizations succeeded in some places and failed in others, but one of the more plausible and interesting theories is that Europe and Asia succeeded because they're wide instead of tall. The very shape of continents may have changed the course of human history. You see, when a continent is wide, you have a ton of land with roughly the same climate. Climate tends to change when you go north and south rather than east and west, as a nature of how the Earth rotates around the sun. Much of the success of early civilizations had to do with the domestication of plants and animals and the corresponding technology. When expanding horizontally, the climate is similar enough that an empire can use the same successful plants and animals, while expanding vertically requires the domestication of new plants and animals. If a civilization started in Central America, for example, there would be very little land on the continent with a similar climate, and their expansion would be severely limited. In Europe and Asia, on the other hand, there's thousands upon thousands of miles of similar climate that can be reached just by traveling east or west. Just look at the maps of the four largest early empires: the Qing Dynasty, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, and the Mongol Empire. They were all in Eurasia, and they all expanded horizontally. When some of the more modern empires expanded, they had the technology to do so overseas. The three major modern empires were the British, Spanish, and French empires, each of which came from relatively similar climates. A major reason why America was able to succeed is because all the agriculture from Europe worked there. Climatically, Europe and America are nearly identical. The majority of developed colonized countries are in the Northern Hemisphere just because they were closest to Europe. But formerly British countries like South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand are all highly developed and in the Southern Hemisphere. Their success over more northern countries in the Southern Hemisphere can also be partially attributed to their greater climate similarity to Europe. Let's ask one more question. If our world only had one city, where would it logically be? Well, if you take the location of every person in the world and average it out, you come to South Central Asia. That means that this general region is the optimum place to live on the planet. But where more specifically should our world city go? Well, this region is already in the Northern Hemisphere and in Eurasia, so we've already covered those two criteria. We want a place within 100 or so miles of the ocean, on a navigable river, near mountains with rich mineral deposits. The single best place for a city on Earth just might be Dhaka, Bangladesh. Every geographic model and theory says that there's no better place on Earth to put a city than here. There's evidence to back this up. Dhaka is between the 4th and the 18th largest metropolitan area on Earth, depending on how you define metropolitan area, and Bangladesh is the 6th densest country on Earth. There are 161 million people living in an area of about the size of England. History has affected geography enough that the largest and most advanced civilizations are not all in South Central Asia. But if we started all over again, did humanity a second time, every geographic model says that this region could be the origin and central point of human civilization. I hope you enjoyed this Wendover Productions video. This video
Okay, right, so that video is a treasure trove of AP Human Geography information. Sadly, he does not use AP Human Geography vocabulary terms effectively, but a good practice for you is to go back through that video and start yelling out AP Human Geography concepts with the vocabulary terms that he's talking about. When he was talking about it's really important for the reason the European and the Asian empires were so strong is because they're long. They go east to west rather than north to south because the climate is the same. What's the AP Human Geography term for that, right? The type of climate. And like start to really bend your brain as we're finishing up our urban unit, into applying all of these concepts and all this vocabulary that we have had from other units into what you're studying now. Don't think of this as the urban unit not connected to anything else we've done. Everything is connected. It is a giant tapestry of AP Human Geography goodness. All right, that is the lecture for today. You do have and maybe you don't. Check Moodle to see if you have an assignment that goes along with this. There is a central place theory assignment, but I can't remember if I assigned it today or coming through. All right, so now the next time I will talk at you, we will be on topic 6.5, internal structures of cities.